Welcome to Animated World. Bedtime Stories Part 2.
The Elves and the Shoemaker. Once upon a time, there was a poor old shoemaker who lived with his old wife. The old man made excellent shoes and worked very diligently. But even so, he could not earn enough money to support himself and his family. He became so poor that he could not even afford to buy the leather required to make the shoes. Finally, he was left with only enough material to make one last pair of shoes. His wife was very worried and asked him, "What will happen to us? The closets are bare and we have no firewood. Even our last candle has burned away."
"You don't worry,"
said the shoemaker.
"Things will work out for us. I will finish these shoes tomorrow morning, and someone will buy them."
He cut out the leather and kept the pieces on his workbench and then went to bed, thinking that he would start working first thing in the morning. The very next morning, the shoemaker woke up early and went down to his workshop. On his workbench, he found an exquisite pair of shoes. They had very small and even stitches, formed so perfectly that he knew he couldn't have made a better pair of shoes himself. Upon close examination, the shoemaker could make out that the shoes proved to be of the very pieces of leather he had set out the night before on the bench. The shoemaker called out to his wife to come and look at the wonderful shoes. She was as amazed as he was.
"Who could have made these wonderful shoes?"
she asked. They immediately put that fine pair of shoes in the window and drew the blinds back down.
"Who in the world could have done this for us?"
the shoemaker asked himself. Even before he could think of an answer, a wealthy man strode into his shop and bought the shoes for a very fancy price. The shoemaker was ecstatic and immediately went out and purchased plenty of food for his family and some more leather. That evening, he cut out 2 pairs of shoes and laid all the pieces on the bench so that he could sew them the next day. Then he went upstairs to enjoy a good meal with his wife.
"My goodness,"
the shoemaker cried the next morning when he found 2 pairs of beautifully finished shoes on his workbench.
"Who could make these fine shoes, and that too so quickly?"
He displayed them in his shop window, and before long some rich people came in and paid a great deal of money for them. The shoemaker went right out and bought even more leather this time. This continued for many days until the shoemaker's shelves were filled with wonderful shoes that no one had ever seen before. Soon his little shop was crowded with customers and prospered like never before. One day, the shoemaker and his wife sat by the fire.
"We shall have to learn who has been helping us,"
the shoemaker said to his wife.
"We could hide behind the closet in your workroom to find out who is helping us,"
suggested the wife. That night, when the clock struck 12, the shoemaker and his wife heard some noise. 2 tiny men, carrying a bag of tools, were squeezing beneath a crack under the door. Their clothing was old and worn out, which made the shoemaker and his wife sad. They were helping the shoemaker in making shoes, but they didn't have any for themselves.
"Those little elves have done so much for us. We must make some gifts for them."
"Yes,"
said the shoemaker.
"we can make some shoes and clothes that will fit them."
The shoemaker and his wife worked until dawn and laid the presents out on the workbench. Then they hid behind the closet and waited to see the elves. Just as before, the elves appeared again and jumped onto the bench to begin their work. They saw all the presents and began to laugh and shout with joy. They wore the clothes and shoes and made another pair of shoes for the shoemaker and then disappeared beneath the door, never to be seen again. The shoemaker did indeed continue to prosper, but he and his wife always remembered the good elves who had helped them during their hard times. The moral of the elves and the shoemaker is to be thankful and grateful in life. This short story also teaches us to work hard to make things better and must be thankful for all the help we receive from others. The story also highlights the message of helping those in need. In the story, the little elves helped the shoemaker when they needed it the most. In return, the shoemaker and his wife were grateful for the elves' help and made clothes and tiny shoes as a token of thanks for them. The emperor's new clothes? Once upon a time, in a grand kingdom, there lived an emperor who had an insatiable appetite for fashion. His obsession with new clothes knew no bounds. He would spend hours admiring himself in the mirror, twirling in silk robes and posing in velvet capes. His treasury emptied, and his advisers fretted, but the emperor remained undeterred. Now, in a distant corner of the kingdom, 2 cunning weavers arrived. They were no ordinary weavers. They claimed to possess a magical skill, the ability to create fabrics so extraordinary that they were invisible to anyone who was unfit for their position or downright stupid. The weavers whispered that only the truly wise and competent could see these wondrous garments. Word of their talent reached the emperor's ears. His vanity prickled.
Bring them to me?
He declared.
I must have these invisible clothes.
The weavers, sensing an opportunity, set up their looms in the royal palace. Day and night, they pretended to weave, their hands moving in intricate patterns. The emperor's ministers, eager to prove their competence, tiptoed into the weaver's chamber. They saw empty looms, but dared not admit it.
Magnificent.
They exclaimed, squinting at the air. The emperor himself paid a visit. He stared at the looms, perplexed.
Am I a fool?
He wondered.
I see nothing?
But pride held him captive.
Carry on,
He commanded, pretending to admire the invisible threads. And so the weavers continued their charade. They mimed draping the emperor in his new attire, a robe woven from moonbeams and starlight. The whole city buzzed with anticipation. The emperor's clothes are beyond compare, they whispered. Finally, the day of the grand procession arrived. The emperor, wearing nothing but his invisible finery, stepped out. His ministers, courtiers, and subjects lined the streets.
Look at our emperor.
They exclaimed.
So regal, so majestic.
But then a small voice cut through the collective delusion. A child, a little boy with wide eyes, pointed and laughed.
But he's naked.
He cried.
The emperor has no clothes.
Silence fell. The truth hung in the air like a forgotten thread. The townsfolk exchanged glances, realizing they had been duped. The emperor blushed, but he couldn't turn back now. So he straightened his invisible collar and marched on, chin held high. And that, my dear friend, is how the emperor's vanity led him to parade through the streets stark naked, while a child's honesty shattered the illusion. Moral of the story: sometimes the simplest truths come from the mouths of babes. And perhaps, just perhaps, true wisdom lies not in fine fabrics but in seeing things as they are. Remember this tale when you encounter vanity or pretense. It's a gentle reminder to stay grounded and listen to the unfiltered voices around us. Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. In a faraway kingdom, in rolling hills and sparkling rivers, lived a young princess named Snow White. With skin as white as snow, lips as red as a poppy, and hair as black as night, Snow White's beauty was legendary, but her true beauty showed from her kind heart and gentle spirit. However, in the castle walls resided another woman, the Queen, Snow White's stepmother. This queen, known for her vanity and jealousy, had a magic mirror that spoke the truth. Every day she would ask,
"Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?"
For many years, the mirror would reply,
"You are, your majesty."
This pleased the queen very much, for she desired nothing more than to be the most beautiful in the land. One day, as the queen stood getting ready in front of the mirror, a scary response filled through the room.
"My queen, though you are fair, Snow White is far fairer than you."
The queen's blood ran cold. Rage and envy filled her. How dare a mere child outshine her? Blinded by jealousy, the queen made a wicked plan to get rid of Snow White. She ordered her faithful huntsman to take the princess deep into the forest and never return. The huntsman, who was kind-hearted and could not bear to harm the young princess, took her far into the woods, but let her go, leaving her to find her way. Terrified, Snow White ran deeper into the forest, tears streaming down her face. The trees whispered and the birds chirped, but all she felt was fear and loneliness. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows, Snow White stumbled upon a charming little cottage. The cottage was so tiny and cute that it seemed to belong in a fairy tale. Exhausted and scared, Snow White knocked on the door, and when there was no answer, she quietly entered. Inside, she found a cozy, messy little home. There were 7 small beds, a table filled with half-eaten bowls of porridge, and an array of tiny chairs. Snow White felt tired and hungry, so she decided to clean the cottage and prepare a meal for its inhabitants. She sang as she worked, and her voice was so sweet that it echoed through the woods. Meanwhile, the cottage's owners were not children but 7 dwarfs who had been living there for years. They were miners who spent their days digging for precious gems. When they returned home that evening, they were surprised to find their cottage neat and clean and a delicious-smelling meal waiting for them. The dwarfs, known for their kindness and love for music, were surprised to see a young girl at their doorstep. But upon hearing her story, they welcomed her with open arms. The dwarfs felt sorry for Snow White and offered her a place to stay. She gladly accepted their kindness and soon became their friend. She helped with the cooking, cleaning, and tidying up, and the little cottage became a warm and happy home. Meanwhile, the queen, filled by her obsession with beauty, once again asked her magic mirror. To her anger, the answer remained the same. Snow White was still the fairest of them all. She learned from her magic mirror that Snow White was still alive and living with the dwarfs. This time, the queen wouldn't be stopped. Dressed as an old sailor, the queen arrived at the cottage and offered Snow White a beautiful, shiny red apple. She tricked Snow White with a poisoned apple. Taking a bite, Snow White fell into a deep sleep. The dwarfs, returning home to a very quiet cottage, found their beloved friend seemingly lifeless. Heartbroken, they carefully placed Snow White in her bed covered with flowers, vowing to protect her forever. News of Snow White's bad luck spread throughout the kingdom. A young prince, charmed by stories of her beauty and kindness, ventured deep into the forest. Reaching the clearing where the dwarves kept watch, he was mesmerized by the sight of Snow White sleeping peacefully in her bed. Drawn by a strange force, the prince leaned down and kissed Snow White. As if awakened by a magic spell, Snow White's eyes fluttered open. a symbol of true love, broke the curse of the poisoned apple. The dwarves, overjoyed, welcomed the prince into their midst. Soon Snow White and the prince fell deeply in love, their bonds stronger due to the hard times they had faced. The queen, very angry by yet another turn of events, stormed into the dwarves' cottage. But this time the dwarves, alerted by the forest animals, were prepared. They chased the queen away, stopped her from harming Snow White ever again. Snow White and the prince, with the dwarves by their side, returned to the castle. Justice prevailed, and the kingdom celebrated the triumph of good over evil and the power of true love. Snow White, with her kindness and compassion, became a beloved queen, ruling the land with wisdom and grace. And so, the story of Snow White reminds us that even in the darkest of times, kindness, courage, and the love of good friends can overcome any obstacle. The Foolish Dog. Once upon a time, in a bustling village, there lived a stray dog named Rover. Rover was always hungry. One day, as he wandered near a butcher's shop, he smelled something irresistible, a juicy bone with a generous piece of meat still attached. Rover's eyes widened and his mouth watered. He grabbed the bone and ran to a quiet corner away from prying eyes. There, he settled down to enjoy his newfound treasure. He gnawed on the bone, savouring every bite, and felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't known in a long time. But as he chewed, Rover's thirst grew. The salty meat made his tongue dry and he longed for water. So he decided to head to the nearby river. But what about his precious bone? He couldn't risk losing it. As Rover stood on the bridge over the glistening river, he looked down. His reflection stared back at him. A hungry, thirsty dog with a bone in his mouth. But wait! In the water, he saw another dog. An identical dog, but with an even bigger bone. Greedy Rover's eyes widened. He wanted that bigger bone too. Without thinking, he barked at his own reflection, hoping to scare away the other dog. But as he opened his mouth to bark, the bone slipped from his jaws and fell into the water below. Rover watched in horror as his treasure sank. He had been foolish and greedy. Now he was left with nothing but regret. The moral of the story: be content with what you have. Greed can lead to loss, and so Rover learned a valuable lesson that day, a lesson he would carry with him forever. Remember, my friend, sometimes what we desire most is right in our hands. It's essential to appreciate what we have rather than chasing after more. Cinderella. Once upon a time, in a faraway kingdom, there lived a young girl named Cinderella. She was a kind, gentle, and beautiful child with the most radiant smile. Cinderella had a heart full of love, but unfortunately, fate hadn't been kind to Cinderella. Her mother had passed away, leaving her alone with her selfish stepmother. The stepmother had 2 daughters of her own, and she was terribly jealous of Cinderella's beauty and kind heart. She treated Cinderella unfairly, making her do all the housework and dress in rags, while her own daughters wore fine clothes and lived in luxury. Despite the cruelty she faced, Cinderella remained kind and gentle, never letting her stepmother's unkindness change who she was. She would often seek comfort in the garden, talking to the birds and the animals who had become her dearest friends. One day, the kingdom received exciting news. The prince was hosting a grand ball at the palace, and every maiden in the land was invited. Cinderella's stepsisters were overjoyed and spent weeks preparing their gowns and practicing their dance moves. Cinderella watched her stepsisters with a sad smile, hoping she might be able to attend the ball and experience a bit of the magic she had heard about in her mother's stories. But her stepmother was insistent that Cinderella would stay home and continue with her cause. The night of the ball arrived, and Cinderella was left alone in her old clothes while her stepsisters and stepmother departed for the palace. She sat by the fireplace, tears in her eyes, wishing for just a taste of the magic her mother had told her about. Suddenly, a soft, sweet voice filled the room. It was her fairy godmother, a beautiful figure surrounded by a soft, glowing light.
"Why are you crying, my dear?"
The fairy godmother asked. Cinderella explained her wish to attend the ball, but how her stepmother had been unkind and refused to allow her to go. The fairy godmother smiled and said,
"Don't worry, my child. You shall go to the ball."
With a wave of her wand, Cinderella's rags were transformed into a stunning gown, and on her feet she wore the most delicate glass slippers that sparkled like stars. Her fairy godmother turned a pumpkin into a magnificent carriage and mice into beautiful horses, so Cinderella could travel to the palace in style. Before she left, the fairy godmother gave Cinderella a piece of advice.
"Remember, my dear, the magic will only last until midnight. When the clock strikes 12, you must leave the palace and return home."
Cinderella thanked her fairy godmother and climbed into the magical carriage. As she arrived at the palace, she felt like a princess, her heart dancing with joy. The moment Cinderella entered the ballroom, the entire room fell silent. The prince, charmed by her beauty, approached her, and they danced together like a dream. Cinderella was the happiest she had ever been. But as the hours flew by, she suddenly heard the bells of the palace clock. The first stroke of midnight sent a shiver down her spine. She remembered her fairy godmother's warning and knew she must leave. Cinderella hurriedly said goodbye to the prince and fled from the palace. As she ran down the grand staircase, one of her glass slippers slipped off her foot. She didn't have time to retrieve it, and so, with only one glass slipper, she disappeared into the night. Cinderella's beautiful gown and glass slippers turned back into rags, leaving her with only the memory of the enchanting evening she had spent at the palace. The next day, the prince was determined to find the owner of the glass slipper. He and his attendants travelled throughout the kingdom, visiting every home to see if the slipper would fit any young maiden. When they arrived at Cinderella's cottage, her stepsisters eagerly tried to fit their feet into the glass slipper, but it was too small for them, and their feet simply couldn't squeeze in. Cinderella watched, hidden from view, as her stepsisters attempted to trick the prince. Then she stepped forward and, with a hopeful heart, asked,
"May I try?"
The prince agreed, and as she placed her foot into the glass slipper, it fit perfectly. The prince's eyes lit up with joy as he realized he had found the maiden he had danced with at the ball. Cinderella's stepsisters were astonished and upset, but even though they were mean to her, Cinderella didn't feel angry. Instead, she forgave them for their unkindness, as she believed that kindness was the most important thing in the world. And so, Cinderella was reunited with the prince, and they lived happily ever after, proving that goodness, kindness, and a loving heart could overcome the challenges life may bring.
Pinocchio.
Many years ago, in a small town, there lived a kind old carpenter named Geppetto. Geppetto made beautiful toys for children with wood, and he loved his work. But he was very lonely and wished to have a son. One day, Geppetto was carving a wooden doll. He heard a voice saying,
Hello, Father.
The voice was from a wooden doll. Geppetto was very surprised, but then he was happy and named him Pinocchio. Geppetto told Pinocchio that if you want to be a real boy, you have to go to school and study. But Pinocchio didn't want to go to school, so he ran away from his father and went to play. Old Geppetto followed Pinocchio to catch him. Pinocchio entered a bakery and threw the bread into a mess. The baker informed the police. The police arrested poor Geppetto. Pinocchio was happy and said to himself,
Now I don't have to go to school anymore and I can play as much as I want.
Pinocchio played all day and returned home in the evening, but Geppetto had not come yet. Pinocchio, who was tired and hungry, came out of the house and waited under the rain for Geppetto to come. No matter how long he waited, there was no news of Geppetto. Pinocchio, who was wet from the rain, had to go back home and sit next to the heater to warm himself. He had jumped up and down all day, so he fell asleep there and did not notice that his legs were burning. In the middle of the night, Geppetto returned home and saw that Pinocchio's legs were burnt. Geppetto said to Pinocchio,
Don't worry, I will make new legs for you.
Geppetto worked until the morning and made new legs for Pinocchio. Pinocchio also apologized to him and promised to be a good boy and from tomorrow go to school. Pinocchio, who hadn't eaten anything since the night before and was hungry, Geppetto brought him some pears to eat and be satisfied. That day, Geppetto bought Pinocchio an alphabet book so that he could go to school tomorrow. Pinocchio thanked him. He was happy that he wanted to go to school. The next morning, Pinocchio picked up his book and walked towards the school. He reached near the school when a sound caught his attention. Near the school was a circus who was having a puppet show. Pinocchio forgot his promise, sold his alphabet book and bought a circus ticket with his money to watch the show. When Pinocchio saw wooden puppets playing on the stage, he also went on the stage. But the strings of the puppets were tied together and the show was ruined. People laughed when they saw this scene. The circus owner was very angry and wanted to throw Pinocchio in the fire. But when Pinocchio told him the story, he was heartbroken and let him go and gave Pinocchio 5 gold coins to buy another book for himself. Pinocchio went home smiling and happy. This time he really wanted to buy himself an alphabet book and go to school. But on the way, the cat and the fox saw Pinocchio and planned to get his coins. They told Pinocchio, if you plant your coins next to the miracle tree in the forest, the minister will sleep on the tree. The tree will grow coins and you will become rich. We will show you the miracle tree. He followed them, buried his money and slept there. But when he woke up, he saw that he was hanging from a tree. The cat and the fox had dug the ground and taken the coins. Then they tied Pinocchio and ran away. A kind fairy who always watched over Pinocchio sent a falcon to save him. Poor Pinocchio, who was hanging from the tree for several hours in the cold weather, was sick. The kind fairy put him to bed and brought him medicine. Pinocchio asked if this medicine is bitter. The fairy answered yes, but you have to eat it to get better. But Pinocchio said,
I don't like to take bitter medicine.
The fairy said,
If you don't eat, you will die.
Then she clapped her hands and 4 rabbits came with a coffin came on their back. Pinocchio, who was very scared, said,
No matter how bitter it is, I will eat the medicine.
When Pinocchio got better, the kind fairy asked him,
Why didn't you go to school? What happened to the alphabet book?
Pinocchio said,
I was going to school when I saw a poor child. I sold my book to buy him food.
As Pinocchio was talking, his nose started to lengthen, and every moment his nose was getting longer. Pinocchio was scared. He said,
Oh, my nose. Why is my nose so long?
The fairy said,
Because you lied.
When Pinocchio promised not to lie again, the kind fairy asked the woodcutter to fix Pinocchio's nose. Pinocchio said goodbye to the kind fairy and went home, but on the way he saw a carriage full of children going to the amusement park. Pinocchio forgot everything and got into the carriage and went to the amusement park with other children. The children played in the amusement park every day, and Pinocchio had so much fun that he decided to stay there forever. But after a while he noticed that his ears had changed and he had a tail. All the children gradually turned into donkeys. Pinocchio wanted to go home, but it was too late. The owner of the carriage sold all the children to a circus. The owner of the circus was a cruel and greedy man. He forced them to perform dangerous shows every day. One day, while jumping through the ring of fire, Pinocchio fell and broke his leg. The owner of the circus got angry and ordered to throw Pinocchio into the sea. Pinocchio was thrown into the sea. The fishes gathered around him and bit him. Little by little, the skin of the donkey broke and Pinocchio came out. He was very happy to be back to his original state. Suddenly, a giant whale approached Pinocchio from behind and swallowed him. It was very dark inside the whale's belly, but when Pinocchio looked closely, he noticed a light at the bottom of the whale's belly. Pinocchio swam to the light and was very happy to see Geppetto in the whale's belly. They hugged each other. Geppetto said, "When you didn't come home that day, I was worried about you and I came to the sea to find you, but this whale swallowed me." Pinocchio, who regretted his actions, apologized to Geppetto. They waited for the whale to open its mouth and then ran away. Pinocchio, who was wooden and could not drown, but it was very hard for old Geppetto to swim in the sea. They finally reached the shore. Pinocchio took Geppetto home and took care of him. Every day he cooked healthy food for his father to make Geppetto feel better. When Geppetto got better and was able to get out of bed, the kind fairy appeared and told Pinocchio that you have shown kindness to your father. You deserve to be a real boy. And then with a wave of her magic wand, she turned Pinocchio into a real boy. Finally, Geppetto achieved his wish and lived happily with his son until the end of his life.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to our channel.